The beauty and grandeur of nature, the rush of scientific discovery. It all seems a little 19th century, doesn't it? You'd be right about that. That's why understanding Frankenstein means understanding the time in which it was written. There are two things about Frankenstein that really stick out. First, Mary Shelley's odes to nature. Seriously, it's like every couple paragraphs we suddenly get another 3 or 4 or 500 words about nature. Nature revives the characters, feeds their souls, inspires, rejuvenates, even provides a refuge. Why? Don't get me wrong, nature is great and all, but Shelley's love of nature really reflects the spirit of her time. Shelley was writing Frankenstein during the Romantic era, a period when writers were interested in emphasizing the pastoral over the urban. They wanted to reconcile man and nature. The second thing that sticks out about Frankenstein is its scientific concerns. Victor Frankenstein's experiments may seem pretty prehistoric to you, but they have their basis in late 18th and early 19th century scientific questions. In Shelley's time, scientists and philosophers were grappling with evolution and the origin and nature of life. In other words, Shelley may seem out of place among the authors on your shelf, but among the likes of Wordsworth and Coleridge and Blake, she fit right in. Monstrosity. You probably figured that it was one of the themes in this story. But you'd be wrong if you figured that just because this is a book about a monster. Actually, the monster himself is the least monstrous of all the monsters in this story. Monster 1 is the knowledge that Victor uses to create the monster. That knowledge is dark and dangerous, and pretty freaking monstrous. Monster 2 is Victor himself. His secrecy and ambition, and later his revulsion and fear, completely alienate him from society, and eventually, Victor is consumed by an utter hatred toward the monster. Hatred that makes him downright monstrous. But perhaps what's most monstrous of all is society's bigotry and prejudice. The monster only really becomes a monster when he is rejected by society, solely on the basis of his looks. I guess the good news in all of this is that it seems like Shelley is saying that monstrosity is a learned behavior, and the right kind of knowledge frees us from it. Frankenstein is a story about an explorer and a monster and a man who is both. Let's take a look at Mr. Frankenstein himself coming up. Frankenstein is narrated by 3 characters: Robert Walton the explorer, Victor Frankenstein the mad scientist, and the monster himself. But like I said, the man who really matters is Mr. Frankenstein. That's because Walton and the monster are just extensions of the 2 very different aspects of his character. Half of Mr. Frankenstein's character is a man consumed by the desperate pursuit of knowledge. Like Walton, he wants to press the limits and discover new frontiers. But in the same way that Walton gets himself into trouble by pushing the boundaries too far, Frankenstein's knowledge leads him astray too. It impels him to create the monster and to discover the monster within himself. That's the second half of Frankenstein's character: vicious loathing, and untempered desire for revenge. Eventually, Frankenstein can only be characterized by his lack of humanness. In the end, his monstrosity kills him, and, as though it really were a part of him, Frankenstein's monster dies too. Frankenstein's monster is a character in this story, and it's also a symbol. At least, that's what some people say. We'll check out the meaning of the monster, so stay with me. So one thing you may have noticed about this story is that its women are pretty passive. And this comes as sort of a surprise, since Mary Shelley's mother was a feminist. For someone raised in a household where the rights of women were so important, why didn't Shelley write better female characters? Here's the subversive thing. Shelley actually made a pretty important statement about women, but she did it through the monster, not through her female characters. Frankenstein's monster is rejected and abused because he dares to try to be human, to be equal to a man. That's why some critics have argued that Frankenstein's monster is a symbol of the fate of women who don't live up to society's expectations of them, and the result is that they are treated like creatures instead of human beings. In other words, the monster is a symbol of the woman's struggle in Shelley's time. Actually, that was pretty smart of Shelley. Strong female characters may not have gotten people's attention, but a monster? Now there's a feminist statement that's hard to ignore. I said that Frankenstein was really the character that mattered, but that's not entirely true. A good third of this book is the monster's story.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
Mini recap. The monster might as well be a human, at least at the beginning. It learns by observation. It craves connection. It wants to love and to be loved. It spends months observing a peasant family only to be rejected and abused. And then, and only then, is when it becomes a real monster. Now, I don't want to get ahead of myself because we're going to talk about the themes of monstrosity and knowledge in recaps 7 and 8. So remember this about the monster. He's a physical manifestation of Shelley's story. Here's what I mean. In the same way that the monster is a mishmash of parts, he's also an embodiment of the many themes of this book. His existence demonstrates that monstrosity is not innate, but learned. The way he acquires knowledge, both good and bad, reveals the benefits of knowledge and its dangers. And finally, in the same way that this book is a tapestry of texts, so, in a way, is the monster. With no knowledge of his own, the monster is a blank slate, and his story is formed as others apply their own characterizations of the monster to the monster. If you think that the only motivation Mary Shelley's book has to offer is the motivation to be some kind of green-headed monster for Halloween, think again. Mary Shelley began writing Frankenstein when she was 18 years old. Did you catch that? When she was 18 years old. That's like you writing a book of enormous cultural importance during your senior year in high school. Can you imagine finding the time? Especially on top of college applications? Okay, so now that we're done oohing and aahing over Mary Shelley the Prodigy, what now? I'm not saying that Shelley's book should have you writing your own just as soon as you've gotten your driver's license, but I think it is a motivation to get involved. That's because Frankenstein is really about engaging with politics, about thinking through the issues of our time. In Shelley's book, knowledge that's pursued at the expense of everything else is dangerous. But I would argue that in her eyes, a lack of knowledge is also dangerous. Shelley's point is really about what we do with knowledge, how we use it. It's also about the fact that we should get involved. We should use knowledge to tackle the issues that are vexing our society. After all, if you don't, who will?